Since my last video on the subject, the war in Ukraine rages ever on between Russia and Ukraine, although increasingly it seems that Russia has been on the back foot. The map of Russian control over Ukraine looking like this in March and having shrunk severely by October, where we are now, to just the east and the south of the country, whereas before there had been a large northern offensive as well. Russia announced partial mobilization, leading to new recruits being taken from the male population and brought into the army that soon will be going to the front line. Furthermore, they also held elections in several of the regions that they had occupied since the start of the invasion in Ukraine, and a great surprise to everyone, they overwhelmingly voted in favor of joining Russia, of being annexed to Russia, even though much of the voting seems to have been done at machine gun point, and the results, well, they don't exactly look like normal results in such an election. But the Ukrainian military has nonetheless been doing very well in terms of counterattacks against Russian-occupied areas in Ukraine, and have made great gains in especially the north of the country in Kharkiv, but are also now moving on Kherson in the south of the country as well. Part of this is due to the fact that they have sophisticated weapon systems, many of them given by the United States and other powers around the world, particularly the HIMARS or the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System has been especially effective at hitting Russian positions with accuracy and from far behind the front lines, thus giving them an advantage. Furthermore, more training of Ukrainian units by the West, particularly in the United Kingdom, by various nations, and cycling of troops has led to Ukrainians having a generally higher morale and being better trained on the front than their Russian adversaries. This also will lead to further gains, I think, in the future Ukrainian offensives. Given these recent defeats on the battlefield, Russia has announced partial mobilization, and they have around 300,000 men now being moved into the army and receiving some very basic training. They've also been threatening with nuclear weapons in the hope that they might be able to force Ukraine to the negotiating table, or the West, more likely, to stop supporting the Ukrainians with arms and advanced rocket systems. But so far, none of that has worked. But another of his options in this war for Putin is the use of Belarus, and that's what I want to talk about today, as Belarus has so far been Russia's staunchest ally, and there is once again talk that Belarus might in fact join the war and so add his manpower to that of Putin, as well as the strategic position of Belarus. Now, I did actually already talk about this, I think back in February or March, when the war was just about a month old, about whether Belarus would also join in and their wider role in the war. Now, of course, that actually did not come to pass, which is what I predicted in this video. But given that we're quite a few months on, I thought it might be a good idea to look back at Belarus now to see if that situation has changed and if Belarus might in fact be getting a larger role in the war to come, as some have suggested. Well, let's begin with Belarus's president, Alexander Lukashenko, or Lukashenka. He's been the president since 1994 and has ruled as a dictator, basically moving on from the Soviet period in much the same way. He's been closely tied with the Russian state and with Putin, especially so in more recent years, where he's been more financially dependent on Russia and with more overtures coming from Russia to form a sort of union between Belarus and Russia. Although ultimately Lukashenko has resisted this to some degree, it's uncertain how much autonomy he still has. Belarus, of course, has a strategic position to the north of Ukraine and to the west of Russia, making it a key buffer state as Russia sees it between itself and other NATO countries, and indeed a strategic position to the north of Ukraine. It was already speculated, as I mentioned, that Belarusian troops might join Russian soldiers in the offensives into Ukraine, particularly in the north, and possibly to hold guard duties behind Russian lines while Russian soldiers did the fighting. Although ultimately, as we found out, Belarus didn't in fact join the war, and Belarusian troops stayed on their side of the border, albeit aiding Russian soldiers from there with missile launches and transport, etc. The inclusion of Belarus into the war would be some support for Russia even at this point. The Belarusian army is only around 62,000 strong, and of course they are quite untested in battle. They do have a reserve force of 344,000, but given that Belarus has not yet even committed its regular army, it probably doesn't make sense that these would also be added to the number, and we can only imagine that these aren't in the best shape either. However, on the 10th of June of this year, Lukashenko did actually make a suggestion that Belarus might be joining the war, because he said, and I quote, that he feared being chopped off by NATO, and therefore it might be necessary for Belarusian troops to join in the attack on Ukraine. He also created a people's militia, getting in touch with various heads of fishing and hunting boards in Belarus to provide around 5,000 men, although as that sort of sounds, I'm not sure how effective an offensive fighting force this will be. He did also order several Iskander missiles from the Russians, although how he intends to use this or whether this is just a show of force, we don't really know, as well as some aircraft from the Russians as well. So, is this a suggestion that Belarus might be gearing up for an attack on Ukraine? Well, it seems like quite a small start just for such a large offensive. The Belarusian army is only 62,000 strong or thereabouts, and they have been untested in combat. They have not fought in any major conflicts at all, and we don't know what the state of corruption and the state of actual preparedness is, just as we saw with the Russian army and are seeing now with the mobilization. It's probably the same, if not worse, in Belarus, given the state of corruption there. Furthermore, if the regular Russian army, which at times was deemed to be the second best army in the world, had so much difficulty invading Ukraine from the north and in larger numbers, it doesn't really make sense that a smaller force, because of course that whole army isn't going into Ukraine, so a force of around 30,000 Belarusian troops, there's no reason to suspect that they might do any better than the Russians who had attempted. And of course the Ukrainians that are in the north of Ukraine have already defended it once. They know the avenues of attack, they've already had a potentially much harder foe to fight there, so strategically it does not really bode well for any Belarusian thrusts into northern Ukraine at this point, even if supported by Russian conscripts or the regular army, yet this also seems unlikely. A second point to consider is that strategically northern Ukraine is now less important, or actually less attainable for the Russians. If we look here at the map of the situation we saw in March, possibly the height of Russian control in Ukraine, and we take a look at how it looks now in October, you can see that the part of Ukraine that borders Belarus is no longer being controlled by the Russians. They moved instead to focus their offensive on the Donbas, and it seems unlikely that the Russians, given the state of their military at the minute, will be trying any more offensives in the north. It therefore seems unlikely that Belarusian troops would be directly involved on the other side of the border, even if they are supporting Russian troops there. Given that we're moving towards winter, it seems very unlikely we're going to see any new offensives until the spring, and so for now I think these threats are largely empty. Something Lukashenko also has to consider is his own population, as there have been huge opposition protests and indeed acts of violence against the regime in recent years, and particularly since the start of the Ukraine conflict. The war is incredibly unpopular in Belarus, as I also showed in my previous video, and certainly compared with public opinion in Russia, where it's generally viewed quite favorably. We saw, for example, that Russian troops using Belarusian rail networks faced sabotage by Belarusian rail workers who blew up train tracks and otherwise sabotaged Russian equipment and personnel as they made their way to the Ukrainian front. So much so that Lukashenko actually imposed the death penalty on railway sabotage that interfered with the Russian invasion. Furthermore, as I've already made a video about, Belarusians are actually fighting in the Ukrainian war, but on the side of Ukraine, in the form of several Belarusian battalions of volunteers that are fighting on the Ukrainian side. It seems possibly quite likely that there will be even more recruitment into these groups, perhaps even by units of the army, depending on how mutinous they are, if Lukashenka does in fact announce that they will be moving into Ukraine as well. These are all things that he needs to consider, because dissatisfaction with his regime is only growing in Belarus, and he has to walk a kind of tightrope between that dissatisfaction at home and appeasing Vladimir Putin and the Russians, which are his only allies, particularly in the region. A further point is that actually the Belarusian army itself, the higher echelons of command, are also not in favor of joining the war. And so it might actually be the case that if Lukashenka does announce joining the war, he will be deposed in a coup by his army generals, whom he relies on for support. So this again makes it seem unlikely that Belarus is going to join the war at this very time. However, by feigning an invasion, Lukashenka and Belarus might actually be fulfilling a strategic role that aids the Russians, because it's meant that Ukraine has had to keep several units back around the area of Kyiv and northern Ukraine in order to potentially counteract such an invasion were it to come. Of course, this means that there can be fewer troops in the very east of the country, where most of the fighting is happening at the minute, and where the Ukrainians could use more men at all times. So really it forces Ukraine to keep its troops split and have some troops in reserve on that northern frontier to ensure that the Belarusians won't invade and then take Kyiv nonetheless, which, as I said, seems incredibly unlikely. However, as Putin's situation gets worse and worse, with some dissatisfaction at home, particularly against the mobilization, but particularly with Ukrainian advances on the battlefield and advances into areas that have now been annexed into Russia proper, as he sees it, it seems that he may continue to grasp at more and more unlikely sources of aid, whether that is in the form of nuclear weapons, which I also think is very unlikely, or in the form of trying to bring Belarus into the war to bring that extra manpower and equipment on side is unclear, but it does grow more likely as things deteriorate on the front. A final point to consider is that Belarus owes a lot of money to Russia, as Russia has financially been backing it. If it gets to a point where the Russians really need those extra troops and the extra support from Belarus, it's possible that they might call in the loans at an inopportune time and then force him into action. But that all remains to be seen, whether Belarus will join the Russian game or whether it will continue to sit on the fence whilst shouting loudly over it, as they have done previously and as I believe they will continue to do. So that is my video on Belarus and whether they will be joining in the conflict in Ukraine once again. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I thought I would once again make a video about Ukraine, seeing as a lot of people seem to enjoy it and enjoy watching it, and it was well worth coming back to the subject, as of course this is still ongoing and we shouldn't forget about it. Do let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos about Ukraine and about the various updates that we've had from there, or if you want me to focus more on the actual history content. In any case, whatever sort of feedback I get, I'll be doing bits of both, or well, definitely keeping up the history content, and depending on the response, maybe some more things about Ukraine and the geopolitical situation surrounding it there as well. So yeah, I appreciate all the support. If you could hit that notification bell, that would be great, because I know a lot of people have had issues with YouTube not recommending my videos, and that's rather annoying if you want to be kept informed. So please do that and give me a thumbs up and leave me a comment behind, because that all really helps. But in the meantime, I have been Hilbert, and this has been the incredibly recent and ongoing history.